Hello everyone, today in this video we'll fight against the atmospheric trough of our world around us, and this time we will consider one very important thing that needs to be taken into account while listening to some news or reading some books or articles. What are the issues we need to look at, and what they mean. I like to explain the things I plan to explain with giving the examples. As the followers of my channel know, one of my favorite topics I like to read about and explore on my own is the um, history of Muslim Spain. Not only because we know that Muslim Spain was at the frontiers of Muslim and Christian world, and also it was a Umayyad state for long, up to 1031 AD officially, and it was also surrounded by, in majority, hostile Muslim states through the sea on the south, from their southern coast, because actually very quickly the Fatimid Caliphate and its vassal states were formed, and these states were not so friendly to Moors in Spain, as European tradition tends to call them, Moors in Spain. So we know that Moorish Spain, for the entire period of its history, turbulent history very often, it was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious state. Of course, with time, the conversion to the religion of the Prophet from Mecca was progressing, and during its height, so the reign of first Caliph of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman III, actually the number of Muslims in the Cordoban Caliphate, those days freshly formed, was about from 70 to 75%. In the next generation, it reached about 80. The remaining 20, one uh, should uh, one should assign to Catholic Christian population, about 15%, and the remaining, more or less 5 6, to Jews. Okay, so we see that first myth is actually done, that that living in harmony between minorities, mutual respect and tolerance, multiculti, fairy tales, these facts actually debunked this myth, because why was conversion progressing relatively quickly? Because initially the Muslim conquerors were in tiny minority, only conquerors, but somehow within 2 3 centuries, the conversion curve reached about 80% of the entire population. So it means that conversion was giving some profits, or it was not depriving people from having some profits. So it means that there was no equal treatment of people of all religions and nationalities, that it was not so colorful and tolerant as one can see. These are simple facts. And also among Muslims themselves, there were divisions. Old division between Arabs and Berbers, old division between older people who practice Muslim faith for many generations and people who freshly converted, muwalats. It was also a field of conflict with many tensions between these two groups. There were also conflict between all religious formations like Christian, Jews, and Muslims, and also in between them, sometimes conflicts were happening. And we see that this myth doesn't survive the confrontation with reality. But where did it come from? Mainly, it came from the modern academic from the 70s and 80s, like Mrs. Maria Rosa Menocal, who was who was Cuban-born professor of literature in one of the American universities from Ivy League, and she was studying poetry of troubadours. And if one study poetry of troubadours, there are two, in my opinion, two realistic hypotheses that troubadours were originated from the interaction between Provençal culture and culture originated in Islamic Spain, also incorporated partially to Islamic Spain from the east in the 9th century by the refugee from the Abbasid court, Mr. Ziryab, poet, dancer, musician of black origin, who was very talented guy, and introduced to Al-Andalus elite some rules of the etiquette he learned on the court of Abbasids. And later, of course, it was evolving this culture, and after conquest of city of Barbastro by Provençal and Aquitanian forces in 1064 AD, some of these artists and dancers and poets were taken into captivity, and after some time, of course, quite quickly, the elite of the nowadays southern France, so Occitan people, started developing their own beautiful troubadour poetry, and later the French equivalents, trouvères, were also formed. So this is one hypothesis. Second hypothesis is that troubadours were also developed under the influence of Catharism, so Albigensian sect, as an opposition to the church. One theory doesn't exclude another, but we see that that they were formed because of the interactions between different civilizations and cultures. Okay, it's fine. And Mrs. Menokal was studying it. Later, her interest shifted into Al-Andalus literature. She is the editor of one of the volume in History of Arabic Literature. Of course, the volume she edited is the Literature of Al-Andalus, quite nicely done. But when sometimes people who work in literature start working in history field and writing about history, she wrote a book, Ornament of the World, some essays, beautiful ones, nicely written, about Muslim Spain, but she succumbed to this literary vision of very tolerant and nicely living in harmony elites of Muslim Spain. Unfortunately, imagination took over and defeated the reality in her mind and in her book, and it's a little bit, or even too much, idealized picture of the reality. We see that when we study more documents from Muslim Spain. That's why we should read some more books like written by a Spanish author Maribel Fierro, Mr. Dario Fernandez Morera, also Cuban-born American historian, and Mr. Brian Catlos. Then we will have much more balanced view of Muslim Spain. Because elites, of course, they were living completely different than simple people, despite the fact the hierarchy was very well defined in the court and of caliph and in the courts of local lords, that there were some even groups of Muslims which were not treated very well, and Christians and Jews and others had to know their place. Of course, hierarchy was, as I said, very well designed and defined and obeyed. And of course, they were creating beautiful literature, science, and so on. But there was no way on earth to say that everyone was treated with absolute tolerance and that there was absolute equality in laws and other privileges. No. And that's why we see that sometimes people who were studying literature did a great job in this field. When they went into history, they succumbed to the illusion of great paradise of the tolerance, and that's why a book that presents us the picture of Muslim Spain completely on the opposite pole than the book of Ornament of the World by Maria Rosa Menukal is the book I mentioned here by Mr. Dario Fernandez Morera about the myth. The title of this book is Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, where Mr. Dario Fernandez Morera really well researched the historical sources and proves us this what I actually said. The hierarchy and very strictly defined social relations and social connections within the society of Muslim Spain. So this is a book presenting us a view of the Muslim Spain from a completely different optics. And the book that presents us the picture of Muslim Spain more or less in between the work of Dario Fernandez Morera and Mr. Maria Rosa Menucal is the work of Mr. Brian Catlos, entitled Kingdoms of Fate. Surprisingly, all authors I mentioned writing recently about Muslim Spain have Spanish surnames, and two of them are of Cuban origin. I don't know how it happened. It's a funny coincidence. That's why, in order to have our own view of the Muslim Spain, we need to read 3 of these books or even more and find our own consensus. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, everyone should read new things, new authors, but first of all, before we read them, we should see at the author's past. We should look at the author's past. We should investigate the worldview of this author, his or her connections, where they work, where they take money from, and who was their supervisor, and who actually briefly gives them food. That's why with this knowledge we will be able to more or less know what are their preferences and what point of view they can represent. So being prepared, we can avoid being misled, or simply we can avoid succumbing to the illusion. And thanks to this approach, we will be closer and closer to the historical truth. All the best, have a nice day, bye.